Welcome to Medical Bellator. My name is Dr. Emmanuel. We're still on the embryological development of the nervous system in a fetus. Today, we're going into the regionalization of the neural tube. Remember the neural tube, which is formed from the neural plate. We are going into the what? The regionalization of the neural tube. Now, when the neural tube starts forming the parts of the central nervous system, because what? It is very, very, very important for the formation of the nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord. What happens? It gets, first of all, remember in the last clip, plate invaginates from the groove, then forms the tube, which is closed like this. At the top, we look at it, it looks like this. It looks like a tube. It's like looking through a straw. Okay? It's like this from the top, or like this from the top. All right. So what happens? Regionalization occurs as the cells keep proliferating and differentiating into the main organ that needs to be formed. All right. Here we're talking about the brain and the spinal cord. So what regionalization happens here? It forms three parts. It develops into three main parts. I call it the PMR. PMR. Prosencephalon. Proencephalon. Encephalon means brain. Pros, you will see the word pros a lot in medicine. That means precursor. Precursor to the formation or the early development. All right, we have the prosencephalon. After that, what do we have? Prosencephalon, next mesencephalon. Just like we had mesoderm in the last topic. Mesencephalon, middle. Mes is middle, encephalon is brain. Middle part of the brain, or what? The mid-brain. Next part, which is the third part after the PM, is the R. The R is what? Rhombencephalon. Encephalon is brain, rhomb, like rhombus shape. Shape of a rhombus, all right? Now, remember these three main parts. These three main parts of the neural tube going through regionalization. As it goes through regionalization, PMR, prosencephalon, mesencephalon, and rhombencephalon. Now, let's go to the prosencephalon, the first part, the P. The prosencephalon divides into what? The telencephalon and the diencephalon. Prosencephalon divides into what? TD. P, P, T, D. Telencephalon and diencephalon. What does tel mean? Tel means end, finished part, all right? Finished part of the brain, the end of the brain. Diencephalon, what does it mean? Di means two. Di means to diencephalon. Two parts of a brain is formed from that part, all right? Now, under the mesencephalon, what do we have formed? Under the mesencephalon, we have what is called the midbrain. So under the mesencephalon, what do we have? Still the mesencephalon in the next part that we are explaining, all right? Still mesencephalon. It didn't change. Still mesencephalon because it's the middle, all right? Now, after that was the next. The rhomboencephalon divides into two to form what? To form the metencephalon and the myelencephalon. Metencephalon and myelencephalon. What does myelencephalon means? Spinal. Myel means spinal cord, encephalon means brain. Brain and spinal cord. This is where they both meet. Your spinal cord goes all the way through your vertebrae and meets your brain at the lower part of the back of your head. This is where we call myelencephalon. What does metencephalon mean? The word met means in between. Encephalon means brain, in between brains. Remember, spinal cord meets the brain at this level that I'm pointing in the back of my head. Now, between there and the mesencephalon is the metencephalon. In between. All right. In between the myelencephalon and the between the mid and the part where they meet is called the metencephalon. This is where they met. Just to remember it that way. This is where they met. So remember what I mentioned about the what? Myelencephalon, where the spinal cord meets the brain. So this is your spine. This is lower back, all right? This is your lower back. This is what's called the sacral region, all right? You have all these vertebral bones, all right? You have the vertebral bones. Of course, you have sacral, medically, sacral, you have your lumbar, you have your thoracic, and you have your cervical, all right? So this is your back. This is your spine, all right? And your spinal cord is within the vertebral canal. That's why your spinal cord is within the bone, for the bone to protect it. And your spinal cord comes out of here and it meets, this is your skull. The brain is here. This is where it goes in and it meets with the brain, all right? So that's where you have your myelencephalon region, all right? That's spinal cord, encephalon, that's brain. This is where they meet. This is just to make it very simple for you all right? Now, let's go into more parts, starting all over again for the telencephalon. So remember again, the beginning parts during regionalization of neuro 2, you have PMR, P prosencephalon, divides into what? Telencephalon and what? Diencephalon. Telencephalon means end, tail, and encephalon brain. All right, which is, if you start from back to the top, this is it right here. It's in this part. That's why you have your cerebral hemisphere and the basal ganglia. Your telencephalon forms your what? Your cerebral hemisphere, which is your brain. Remember, the brain is two parts. You have the left and the right hemisphere. All right, held together by the corpus callosum. So your telencephalon forms your hemisphere, your left or right hemisphere, and then your basal ganglia. Your basal ganglia, meaning at the base of the brain, you have your basal ganglia. All right. Now, that's for your telencephalon, which comes from the prosencephalon. The diencephalon, dia means two. What does it form that's very important? It forms a very, very important part of the brain. You have your thalamus and your hypothalamus. Your thalamus and your hypothalamus. All right. That's what's formed from the diencephalon, thalamus, hypothalamus. Also, there's an articulation of the retina to that area, but that's by the way. Now, let's go into the next part. The mesencephalon, what does it form? Remember, the mesencephalon is midbrain, middle, encephalon, brain, midbrain, middle part of the brain. What is formed in this area? It's still the midbrain. Still haven't changed. It still went from mesencephalon, which is midbrain, to mesencephalon, All right. Now, let's go to the rhombencephalon. Rhombencephalon forms what again? The metencephalon, which is in between the myelencephalon and the mesencephalon. And rhombencephalon forms, again, myelencephalon and metencephalon. How do you remember it? Metmy encephalon. Met my encephalon. Met my encephalon. I met my encephalon. So the metencephalon and the myencephalon are the two parts of the rhombencephalon. They both come out of the rhombencephalon. And what happens? The metencephalon ends up forming what? It ends up forming your pons and cerebellum. It ends up forming your pons and your cerebellum. Remember, when you look at the brain, your cranial nerves, your 12 cranial nerves, you have your cerebral hemisphere, right? Two of them. And then from there, you will see the midbrain. which is mesencephalon. And after that, what do you see next? You see the pons. And after the pons, you see what? The medulla. Right? Remember that. Remember when you study your 12 cranial nerves, when you look at a picture, for those of you who have studied that, you will see that after your cerebral hemisphere, which comes from where? Which comes from where again? It comes from your prosencephalon, tail encephalon, all right? Next that you see is what? Your midbrain, which comes from the mesencephalon. And after the midbrain, of which you have some cranial nerves that come out of the midbrain, what do you have next? You have your pons. After the pons, what do you have? Your medulla, which is part of your spinal cord, all right? Do not forget that. So out of the metencephalon is what? The pons. After the midbrain, pons. Then the cerebellum. Two things come out of it. Pons and cerebellum. All right. Met PC. Met PC. Metencephalon. PC. What's the PC? Pons and what? Cerebellum. Now, for the myelencephalon, which is brain meeting the spinal cord, or the junction of their meeting or the confluence. What comes out of that? You have your medulla. Remember what I just mentioned with the brain when you study the 12 cranial nerves. Hemisphere, you have your hemisphere, and then going towards the back, because hemisphere is at the front, that's your brain, the main brain. And then going towards the back, you have your midbrain, and then you have your pons, you have your cerebellum, and then you have your medulla oblongata. Again, cerebral hemispheres, midbrain, pons, cerebellum, and medulla. Okay, that's what this formation is about. These germinal layers, or the regionalization of the neurotube, forms all these from the front, which is the brain, here, the cerebral hemisphere, all the way to the back, where you have your what? Your medulla. Let's not forget that, all right? It's very simple to remember. I will make it simple, even simple as much as possible later on. So as a child keeps on growing, what happens? More and more development occurs, even all the way to adulthood. Right? The frontal cortex is well formed, the hemisphere is well formed, and you have also in that part of your brain, your hemispheres, you have what's called your lateral ventricles. When you look at the brain, all right, into half, you will see an area, or you see an area known as the what? Lateral ventricle. That area has a component called the choroidal plexus. Choroidal plexus, mixture of so many blood vessels. That helps in the formation of what? Your cerebral spinal fluid in your lateral ventricle, on your cerebral hemisphere. That's the beginning part, all right, of your CSF formation. And then after the lateral ventricle, you have what's called what? The third ventricle. The third ventricle also have what? It also has a choroidal plexus for formation of CSF, or cerebral spinal fluid. Now, as it goes down between the third ventricle, remember we have the lateral ventricle, and then through a foramen, it goes into the third ventricle. Between the third ventricle, as the fluid is being formed and the fluid is going down, which is your CSF, or your cerebral spinal fluid, between the third and the fourth ventricle is what's called your cerebral aqueduct. Cerebral aqueduct, all right? Your cerebral aqueduct. It allows for the passage of the CSF from the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle. All right. In the fourth ventricle, you also have the choroidal plexus. So every ventricle in your brain has a what? A choroidal plexus for the formation of what? The cerebral spinal fluid. So going back to the development again, three parts, just to make it a little bit simple. Three parts: PMR, prosencephalon, mesencephalon, rhombencephalon. From the prosencephalon is what? You have the telencephalon and the diencephalon. How do I remember that? PTD, prosencephalon, TD. telencephalon and diencephalon, right? Remember that. Now, mesencephalon remains the same. It is still midbrain all the way till the cerebral aqueduct. The cerebral aqueduct that connects the third and the fourth ventricle is part of the midbrain formation. Don't forget that. Your rhombencephalus gives you what? Your I-met myelencephalon. Not P, I'm sorry. R, rhombencephalon forms what? Met myencephalon. Metencephalon, myelencephalon. Myelencephalon, where the brain and the spinal cord connects. That's what gives you your medulla. All right. That's around your fourth ventricle. Remember the ventricles in the brain for the spinal fluid formation and passage? Yes. Now that's myelencephalon. Metencephalon, which is in between your midbrain and the myelencephalon, is what? What's in there? What's formed around that area? That's where your pons and cerebellum is formed. Your pons and cerebellum. All right, your pons and cerebellum. What do they form at the end of it? That's where you have your upper part of your fourth ventricle. All right, remember, myelencephalon forms the fourth ventricle, but that's the lower part. The metencephalon forms what? The fourth ventricle at the end of it, but that's what the upper part, upper and lower. Remember, the CSF, the cerebrospinal fluid, flows all the way from the brain, from the lateral ventricle. It goes into the third ventricle. It passes through the cerebral aqueduct, into the fourth ventricle, all the way down to your spine. Let's not forget that. All right. Now, let's go back to what we're talking about. Your telencephalon gives you what? Your cerebral hemisphere. That's your brain, left and right part of the brain. And it also gives you the basal ganglia. All right? The basal ganglia. Those two. Your diencephalon gives you very, very important part of the brain, the central nervous system, known as what? Your hypothalamus and your thalamus. That's why it's called di, which means two. Two brains, diencephalon. Some of these other parts of the brain form two parts, but why are they not called diencephalon? This one is for a particular part of the brain or specific parts of the brain that are very, very important. All right. We'll deal with that later on in neurology. All right. So that's for your diencephalon. All right. So that's it for the regionalization of the neural tube. With the regionalization comes the full formation and development of the brain and spinal cord formation.